to see Rosie when we do that, but we
Oh,
there.
okay.
That's okay, Rosie, right? We're not? Yeah. Okay. Thanks for joining us. So I thought maybe it would be good to pick up with the conversation we were having right at the end. So at the end of the amendment, with the two local references, and just see whether people were comfortable with that, whether there's anything else that we might want to ask the agency to include. Rosie's got her hand up.
So for the record, Rosie Kruger, State Director of Child Nutrition Programs at the Agency of Education. I can provide some insight into why there are two different definitions of local that might be helpful for folks in understanding that. So back when this grant program was first being created by the legislature, there was an idea of trying to create an on-ramp for folks. So the first year of the grant program is meant to be asking folks to take steps that would set them up to be able to successfully purchase local foods going forward. And so one of those things is identifying somebody who's going to do that farm to school work. Another thing is creating their definition of local. And the reason for that is that USDA in their procurement rules has an option for schools to apply a geographic preference when purchasing certain items. And if they do that, then they can provide a price preference for that item when it's meeting their definition of local. And that may allow them to consider a local item that is slightly more expensive than a non-local item when all other factors are the same. And so a first step in kind of getting yourself set up to do local purchasing is figuring out, are we going to be using geographic preference? And if we are, what's our definition of local going to be? And USDA rules are very clear that the state agency or the state legislature can't be the ones to define local for the school food authority when it comes to applying a geographic preference. So we can't tell the schools, you're going to use the state of Vermont as your definition. And they, in fact, can use different definitions for different products. So they may choose to use a definition of, within 20 miles of our school for blueberries, and within the state of Vermont for ground beef, and within New England for cheese. That is their decision, and it's USDA's USDA regulations that allow that to be their decision. And so that's why that's one of the criteria for the first year of the grant is for them to set that definition of local. Now, based on some additional procurement changes that have happened since then, increasing the small purchase threshold and the micro purchase threshold, very few schools are actually in a situation where they're applying a geographic preference at this point. And that's quite different than it was a number of years ago when this was first starting to be discussed. But it still is an option. And I think I mentioned that's USDA is looking at making the geographic preference option even more flexible in that rule change that they're proposing and looking for comments on. So this could return to being something that folks are using more commonly. So that's why that's that definition for the first year, and it's up to them to set it. And then while you don't have the power to tell folks what their definition of local needs to be for the purposes of their procurement and the geographic preference option, you certainly have the ability to define local for the purposes of the funds that you're giving them, this grant local foods purchasing incentive program. And so that's where the Vermont definition comes in and why you're using that there.
Very helpful. Thank you for giving us that, especially the part about we have no control over the data. We won't spend any time trying to change that anyway.
I mean, you could strike that at this point and say that, that's not going to be a criteria for year one for you, because I think it is far more important that somebody that a school figures out their tracking system and figures out who's going to be in charge of purchasing local foods. But coming up with that whole process of what are our priorities in our farm to school program, I think is the folks who are involved in this work would tell you that is an important first step.
Okay. Do you have a hand up?
No.
Representative O'Brien?
I just wondered, Rosie, does
just getting the timeline straight here, is there a moment then where a school could be like, yeah, that first year we got 30% local, and then we're all of a sudden like, no, now according to Vermont, you're back down to 13%.
So we ask them to report, per your requirements to us, we ask them to report every year how much they think that they've purchased locally. And we just ask 3 questions. We ask them, actually 2 questions. We ask them what their percentage of local is, and then how confident they are in that. And that's where that data comes from that you're looking at. And you see a number of them have said, 50%, and then said, this is just a guess, because they really have no idea. They're not tracking it. And the idea was to not put additional work on folks who are not equipped to do it, and are not getting the additional funds from you all to do that work. So yes, there is the idea that folks may receive that first year, and then if they don't take additional steps to really be tracking and increasing their local purchases, they may never receive a subsequent year grant.
Rosie, just while we have you, the language on page 17 of the draft.
Do you want me to share my screen?
Well, let's wait, since I'm actually talking to Rosie. It'll be disconcerting if she disappears. But
so yeah, I have a lot of thoughts on that.
yeah, that's okay. So I'll just say before you, so this is the section on the local purchasing, and I had asked Beth just to draft as a placeholder some language to get us thinking about if we did want to ask the agency to include something more than it currently was including, as we talked about yesterday. So with that in mind, yes, we'd be happy to hear your thoughts.
So as written, I think what's on page 17 here is very difficult for us to collect. And in some cases, the data doesn't exist. And I can elaborate on that. For the first reporting item, sorry, I had some notes here. The way that this is happening is when the schools are reporting to us, we're asking them those 2 questions. They're not reporting to us where they're purchasing, and they may not even be tracking it. So in order for us to collect that information, the schools are going to need to be doing a lot more work, and you're requiring that of everybody rather than just the folks who have decided to go through the hoops to get the local foods incentive. So I think we would generally discourage adding a lot more administrative burden to schools without providing them additional resources. And that type of tracking is going to be pretty extensive, because you're not just looking at one invoice, you're asking them, okay, of that invoice, say from a distributor, a big distributor, you got to pull all the different items. Where did the apples come from? Where did the cheese come from? Where did the milk come from, or butter, or whatever? And that's going to be extremely labor intensive. So that's going to be very difficult. Then aggregating that information and giving that all to you is going to be quite difficult. And for those folks that are just saying this is just a guess, that data really doesn't exist. They don't know. They're not tracking it. In terms of, I think what I was thinking that you might ask us for initially was data from the schools who actually did get the subsequent year grant. Those are the folks who are actually doing the tracking, and where data does exist at the school level. We are not pulling all of that data up to the state agency level at this point. We are auditing certain invoices. So we are asking them, what are your totals? We're looking at the totals to find out whether they qualify. And then once we found out that they do qualify, we are asking them to send us a list of all of their invoices, and we're pulling select invoices and making sure that they've coded those invoices correctly to get to the totals that they've gotten to. So we're just pulling a sample. So I think we did provide you the data that Wyndham Northeast had provided to us, but that was not complete data. That was that sample that we collected. So it's going to be a lot more work for those schools to submit all of that information to the agency. If you're looking for complete data rather than just that sample that we're currently asking them for, that data does exist out there. They did have to track it in order to get the local foods incentive, but they're going to have to transmit it to us, and then we're going to have to compile it to you. And so that is going to be labor intensive on both at the local level and at the state agency level. And so, to the extent that you're asking for that additional data, we certainly need more staff time to do that. And I would imagine the local level would tell you that as well.
It does feel like, so appreciate that. It does feel like in order for anyone, whether it's us or the agency or someone else, to evaluate the program and see is it doing what we thought we wanted to do, that at some point we'd need to dig into the data.
So I do have some suggestions of data that's already out there. Vermont Feed has taken on the project of documenting all the producer statements where the producers are saying my item meets the definition of local. So they have a kind of a database that they've created so that a school can look up a product and see, oh yes, this product is already on the database. That means that the producer has supplied the documentation to Vermont Feed. Therefore, I don't need to personally, at my school, keep this documentation or request it from the producer. There may be occasional items where a producer is not selling to a large number of schools or just selling to one school. In that case, that one school would be the one who had the statement from the producer saying they met the definition of local. But that list from Vermont Feed is going to give you a really good picture of certainly the products that are being sold to multiple schools. So if you're curious, what particular sectors are you helping, what particular producers are being helped, that would be a really good starting place. And that data is already out there and readily accessible.
I think yesterday you may have suggested it, Rosie, that we consider an inflator or something to move the 15 cents up annually as prices increase, which seems like, that makes sense. I wonder whether it's purely a coincidence that the way it's structured right now is that it's 15 cents for 15% and so forth, or whether somebody looked at costs and said this actually makes sense to have it be those numbers, that 15% is achievable, and that 15 cents is a reasonable return for getting there.
I think that number came from the advocacy community initially. And I think it was based on what was successful in some other states. So you could certainly ask them more about what research they did on that. But that's where that came from. That was not something that the agency researcher proposed.
Okay. Questions or comments or thoughts?
Well, maybe to keep on going on that. So crunching numbers today, it seems that depending on how much the food costs are per meal, really alters the numbers as far as the grant, the 15 cent per meal, the 20 cent per meal, the 25 cent per meal. For example, if the food costs are $2 a meal, the differential spread becomes greater and greater as you include more and more local food. The costs are pretty profound. Whereas if the dollar amount for food per meal is only $1, it actually fits in there real nicely. So I'm wondering how much the average Vermont universal meal food price, per meal is. Did I make that clear?
The amount of the federal reimbursement that's actually spent on food costs is kind of an average amount, is data that's out there. I don't have it at my fingertips, but I could definitely pull it for you. You also could learn a lot by talking to actual individual food service directors. That's a number that they have in their heads for their programs. And it is going to be a little different depending on what priority they've put on, high quality ingredients versus the number of staff that need to produce those meals, and also based on their economy of scale. But some of the food service directors that you brought in earlier could definitely tell you what their specific food cost is per plate. And that's a number they pay close attention to.
And I feel like we may have that in testimony somewhere.
I can't remember it. I remember $1.60 being thrown around. Does that strike anybody?
I thought it was $1.60 was what came back to the Vermont economy.
Very good, per dollar spent, right.
But one of the food guys from school, we have somewhere in our documents a breakdown of what it looks like. And I thought there was a summary of, this is a sample, but this is how much we spend.
Right, but to separate the costs from the food amount is really important here, because we kind of know.
I'm not sure we have that.
Yeah, that's.
Yeah.
Okay, so any other questions for Rosie? Okay, so what we just heard some feedback from Rosie, the agency, on the language that we've got in there right now. Sounds like it would be a good explanation of why we have those two different pieces of local. Sounds like it would be a challenge to collect the data that's currently described. So thoughts on what we might do here, other than strike the language?
What are we being asked to do? I'm sorry.
So we, what, as a committee? Yeah, so we're looking at the language, and maybe you can bring it up now, Beth. We're hoping to come to a consensus, or at least a direction on what we want this entire bill to look like. And now just specifically focusing on section 7 or 8, whatever it is at the end. Or 6. Yeah. So if we want to make any, so we have a couple of choices, I think. We could say we want the program to look a little different this next year going forward. We'd like to put a change in. Or alternatively, we might say, we're not at that point yet. We might like to ask the agency to do a little bit of work, recognizing that there'll be a cost to that. We've heard that the agency doesn't feel comfortable taking on additional responsibilities without some money to pay for it. Or do nothing at all and just leave the program as it is for another year anyway. That's, this is separate from the independent school, adding independent schools. Was there another change? That's the only change that we've got in there.
Yeah, that's not the food amount though.
Mike.
So I think that what we're trying to get at is that the three priorities for why we want local food in schools, right? And the reality is this program only deals with the one priority, is only really dealing with supporting Vermont farmers. And I think that at this point, sort of try to insert the other priorities, or even the data collection that we would need to get at the other priorities doesn't seem to work. So it feels like we just need to, if that's a conversation we want to have about, is that farmer connection to school, is that climate impact of local food, are those things that we want to feature as priorities of a local food purchase incentive 2.0, that just feels like a conversation we might need to have outside the context of this specific program.
I mean, it's a conversation that we could have after town meeting break, and we got to a point where we felt we wanted to do something. There would still be an opportunity in theory to do something.
So So thank you, Rodney. The information actually is in this little manual. So it's about $1.18 per meal in food costs alone. And when you actually apply the grant numbers as detailed in the bill, the more you spend proportionately on local food, the more it costs the school. I mean, it works out the math works out that way. So, I mean, I'm in the spirit of raising the amounts for the 20% tier and the 25% tier. That's my 2 cents.
So, and do you have a number in mind?
I could do the math, which I'd be happy to do at another time and present my suggestion.
Okay, good. Yeah, let's talk and then we could maybe take a look at that tomorrow. Okay, so that's a possibility. Anybody strongly or not strongly have a different perspective than Representative Rice's summary there? Okay, Rosie, I think that I think you offered yesterday to to include in the report more information to the extent that you had it on the products that were being purchased without us having to change anything in statute. So if that's the case, then, I don't think we need to write anything in.
Yeah, I think that we're happy to provide the information that we do collect at the report, or just separately to the committee without you having to tell us to do that.
And without us
would create additional work.
Yeah, without us telling you to do it too, could we assume that you would let us know if you felt there were anything about the program that we should be doing differently?
Yeah, I'm generally the administration and the agency, discuss legislative priorities and come up with any proposed changes that we need every year. And that's part of our normal process in engaging with the legislature. So if there were any major changes that the agency felt were needed, we would certainly let folks know about that.
Okay. And does I think you sort of introduced the idea yesterday, the agency would be okay with building some sort of inflator into the reimbursement numbers?
I can't speak to whether that would be whether the agency would be in favor of that, but that's certainly done throughout the food programs at the national level, and that if your goal was to ensure that the amount of the incentive kept up with the cost of food, that would be a very appropriate way of doing it.
Okay. John, go ahead.
Oh, no, just quickly, can the agency, does it have enough flexibility to change rules for this? For example, if, it says fluid milk cannot be part of this. So if Vermont actually could start producing here, school-sized fluid milk, or an SU made all their own cider, for example, could those be included in the local food?
No, this legislation specifically says the items that we have to include and exclude, so we don't have that authority. And frankly, the Agency of Education is not interested in being the arbitrator of what counts or what doesn't count. So to the extent that you want to have a state agency more involved in that and give a state agency more flexibility on that, we'd encourage you to ask the Agency of Agriculture, Food and Markets to look at that, because it's really very far out of our wheelhouse to decide if an agricultural product is produced in Vermont or not, and that's why we have put it back on the producer to certify that going forward, because it was very, very difficult for the Agency of Education to do that work.
Representative Rice.
Yeah, so just to Representative Templeman's continued point about the declining incentive of the 20 and 25%. It has struck me that we haven't heard that from the many food service folks who we've had in to testify. So I'm just wondering, Rosie, if you've heard any feedback about well, we got to the 15%, but we looked at the math and it actually doesn't make sense for us to go to 20 or 25%. Has that come across here?
We have not heard that, no.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay, so I feel like we're in a good spot here as far as what we want to do with this section. Beth, do you feel like you know what we want to do with this section?
No? You want to strike it?
Well, no, I think we want to, well, let's see, do we want to strike it? Yeah, I guess we do, right. We want to strike section 6 and but then we want to somewhere else possibly change the numbers. That's just changing the numbers from 15, 20, and 25. And we'll talk about that when we get together tomorrow. And possibly adding into that section something that says that CPI will, automatically increase those numbers.
Can I make one request that if you do put in a CPI escalator, you tell us exactly when to apply that, what month to what month?
Sounds like a good idea. Yeah.
Great, and you're already amending the local foods incentive grant statute, so it's already built in to the bill, so.
Easy to make that change. Yeah.
So I am striking for draft 2.1 for tomorrow, section 6 and 7. Is that what, I don't know, we haven't really talked much about 7, which is the processing conundrum.
Okay. Since we haven't talked about it, let's not.
Leave it, okay.
Yeah, we'll pick it up tomorrow.
Any other changes before
I
tomorrow?
don't think so. Yeah. Thank you.
I did have one other area where I wanted to suggest a change unrelated to local foods.
Sure.
Make it fit?
And I canceled my 3 o'clock, so I'm available. I don't know what the committee's.
We have 4.
We're supposed to be heading downstairs to the House chamber in a
Okay.
minute. But we can hear it quickly.
So this is page 8, line 13, the nonprofit pre-qualified private kindergarten provider. Generally, this language, we understand what to do, but rereading it again, I realized that there are state-recognized independent schools who are pre-qualified private pre-kindergarten providers. So this is just a handful of state-recognized schools. Right now, I can't think of anybody who's in this situation, but theoretically, a state-recognized pre-K through 12 independent school could be a site underneath a public school food authority. You were very clear that you did not want these schools generally to get the universal meal supplement if they were a state recognized school rather than a state approved independent school. But this inadvertently, I think, allows that if they have a qualified pre-K program, then they would get the funds for all of their students, which I don't think was your intention. So maybe Beth has an idea of how to make that a little bit clearer, maybe specifically excluding state recognized independent schools. But I don't think that was your intention. And right now it does open it up to.
Okay, well, thanks for flagging that. And yeah, so Beth, maybe you could connect with Rosie to clarify that and then we can look at it again tomorrow.
Would you like me to make any changes if what Rosie says makes sense, or?
It makes sense to you, yes. Yeah. And highlight them again.